Clare Daly to introduce question number 7.
Thanks, Count Corlin. Minister, this relates to the previous one on foot of your decision to have a review of the 2011 Act in relation to journalists' records, which obviously arose out of the controversy of the media backlash in relation to GSOC accessing journalists' phone records, which was a little bit ironic given that some of the most vociferous objectors to the powers of surveillance for GSOC over the Gardaí are some of the quietest people with regard to the Gardaí exercising powers of surveillance. But nonetheless, it gives a very welcome opportunity now to review the 2009 Act and the 1993 Act from the point of view of respecting the privacy of all citizens, not just journalists. And I'm wondering what your, well, I know what your plans are in that regard, but can we debate it a bit further, because it really does need to be looked at.
Well, as I've already said, if you take the 1993 legislation, that provides that an authorisation for interception may only be granted by ministerial warrant, has to be on application from the Garda Commissioner, the Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces or the Chairperson of the Garda Síochána, and only for the purposes of investigating serious crime or protecting the security state as set out in the 1993 Act. That's the first point I would make, or obviously the relevant statutory provisions. Now, the 2009 Act, I've already said in reply to Deputy Wallace, that clearly has to be on the authorisation of the District Court on application by a senior officer of the relevant bodies. I don't need to go into what they are for the purposes prescribed under that Act. Now, the Acts do have as well, I mean, let's go back to the fact that these Acts went through this Oireachtas, not this during this current term, but it was agreed that there would be judicial oversight of the operation. That is in law. They report directly to the Taoiseach. There is a complaints referee, a judge of the Circuit Court. All of these judges take their roles very seriously, as of course, and they operate completely independently. I mean, it's very important. The powers that we've given to the relevant bodies, they do arise in the context of investigating serious crime. And that's the reality. That's offences that carry a term of imprisonment of 5 years or more in prison, and or for safeguarding the security of the state by the Garda Síochána or the Defence Forces. Now, I'm not going to go into the point I made again earlier about how important it is that these tools are available to the relevant bodies. And again, I would say there's no question of widespread powers being used casually. Let's be very clear on that. The investigatory powers that are set out in law are circumscribed as to their use. Let's be clear on that. They are circumscribed as to their use, not only by the provisions of the relevant Act, but also by the statutory limit on the powers that is in the legislation as regards each of the bodies.
Deputy Clare Daly.
See, I don't think anybody is saying that every householder in Ireland is under surveillance or anything like that. I suppose it comes down to how do you define serious crime and what oversight do you have on that, because what some people might deem to be a peaceful but robust protest, other people would deem to be kidnapping and so on. And the problem is that it's an absolute fact that we have weak monitoring and oversight of the surveillance powers that exist, which in and of itself emboldens rogue elements and facilitates bad practice, because there isn't judicial oversight in all circumstances. Senior Gardaí can self-authorise where they say it's an emergency. The judicial, we've no records. We actually can't say with certainty, because the records and reports produced by the judges are very limited. As Digital Rights Ireland said, one of the judges did do a very thorough job, but in general the reports are on one page and they repeat a standard formula, nothing to see here. The judge in the 1993 Act, it's an even worse situation. He does a review of thousands of data records every year and completes that exercise in one day, visiting McKee Barracks, General Headquarters in the Phoenix Park, the Department of Justice and Revenue. How could that be? And none of the reports have given any information of the amount of requests, the purposes, similar to happens in the UK and indeed in the United States even.
Minister.
Well, I mean, I have a detailed report here in relation to review of the operation, which was presented to the Taoiseach by Justice Robert Eager, for example, a review of the operation of the Criminal Justice Surveillance Act. That is available. I think you've referenced it. There's quite a bit of detail in that. I think by the very nature, you're not going to have the level of detail because of the particular issues that the serious crime that is being investigated. However, I mean, there has to be limits on these powers, of course. There's no question of that. I certainly agree with you on that, and there must be oversight, and there has to be a balance between the competing rights, and we must always be prepared to review. I do agree with you on that, and if need be, to either extend or restrict these powers. And it is important to keep the general law in this area under review. And I certainly, in terms of the report that former attorney and Supreme Court Judge John Murray is doing, I think with his vast experience in the European courts as well, it will be interesting to examine what he says in relation to best practice. And certainly that is something that I would want to ensure that we do have best practice in this area. But I also think we have to be very clear that these are essential tools that Gardaí need in terms of the challenges facing them. I think let's be very clear about that. That's appropriate. But if there is a need for further oversight, certainly that is something that can be considered. We'll have that report, which I think will be important to guide us in relation to journalists, because, as I say, there are particular issues in relation to journalists and protection of the sources. But clearly, if there are always developments in law, and if it comes across very clearly that further oversight mechanisms are required, I think that will be examined, no doubt, in the coming months.
Which we already have, Minister, and your own human rights watchdog has said we need to review this. Internationally, Ireland is out of kilter, and you've repeated there, if you like, oh, we can't give the information because of security reasons or so on. Even in Britain, the report that's published goes to hundreds of pages and accounts details of the numbers of operations, the reason for that operation, and even catastrophic failures where mistakes were made. So how can we learn if we don't have that information? Even America, the NSA, who produces reports for Congress, has that type of detail in it. And issues like the exclusion, for example, of ordinary surveillance from any of these acts need to be looked at. Who monitors the fact that somebody could be trailed, that they could have their house watched, their car traced? None of this. It's only deemed to be devices, and privacy of citizens is really important. I mean, this was sparked by the privacy of journalists whose stories actually were invading the privacy of citizens, but that's a separate issue. But the privacy of people does have to be balanced and protected, but that's for everybody, not just journalists. So I'm really appealing to you to include the other acts and to extend it to records of citizens, not just journalists.
Minister, to conclude.
Well, yes, you make an important point about privacy. And in fact, you came into this House last year and in 2014, and you asked me to carry out an inquiry into the leaking of information to the media in relation, for example, to the Roma children. And I quote you, you said, do some work about sources in Garda Síochána leaking information to the media. And you made that point quite strongly, and that there should be, the GSOC should in fact have the kind of powers which I have been saying are important today. And the Gardaí are under strong legal obligations in the 2005 Act in relation to the privacy of persons. So let's make sure that that is on the table as well. But it is about a balance of interests, as you say. Now, you make the statement that Ireland is very out of kilter with other countries. Well, that is something I have asked Judge Murray to examine, because I have very clearly said, look at the international situation. But let me just make a point to you in relation to that. You can see in quite a number of countries we're certainly not out of kilter. And if you look at what's happened recently in France and Belgium, you don't have to go very far to see the kind of powers that the French have to use currently. Now, I don't want to exaggerate that, because terrorism is one issue and a very important issue, but very clearly the French have given, they're in an emergency situation and have had to give very wide-ranging powers in relation to access to their police forces in order to deal with terrorism. That's a very clear example where this tool is needed, and there are many. Indeed, there are incidents in Ireland in relation to many forms of criminal activity where the Gardaí have to act very quickly and have to access information in order to safeguard children and adults in dangerous situations. So we do need a balanced debate in relation to this.
On question number 8, the Deputy is